I'm going to say that the lesson that I have for the morning message was a bit inspired by a lesson that Brent gave a while back on the word Yahweh. I've been thinking a lot here and there over time about the translation of the word Satan, and I always thought it would be interesting to dive into that a little more for a lesson someday. And I heard Brent give this lesson on the word Yahweh and how we use it, and I thought, well, now's a good time. Maybe I can take this time to dive into this word and give a whole morning message on it. Okay, so I put together a lesson on the word for Satan. This is a large topic, and there's a lot more to it than I can get into in one lesson. I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize the things that I've found by diving into this word. One sec while I move some things around. So the interesting thing about the word is that it's considered a transliterated word. So the idea there, and the idea of translation versus transliteration, is something I need to introduce before we start talking about the word. So the idea with translation is that you convert one word from one language, you take its meaning, and you find an equivalent word in another language. So if you were to translate the word for cat in one language, be it Japanese or Arabic or Russian, you would write the word cat for English. If you were to transliterate the word cat from Japanese, you would write neko. That's the transliterated word cat in Japanese. So there, I'm taking the sounds and writing it in a way in English that you would sort of make the sound in Japanese. If you were to say the word cat in Japanese, you would say neko. So that gives you an idea of what transliteration is versus translation. It can also be done with just using the characters from one language and translating each individual character into another language, like English, just by finding the closest corresponding characters. Or again, just using the sound. A word that a lot of you might know when you think of transliteration is the word baptize. It comes from the Greek word baptizo. Those are really similar sounding words because there is a transliteration happening. The word baptizo means to immerse. The word baptize does give you a little more context once we understand the full meaning. So that is transliteration versus translation. So moving on. The word for Satan in English, we just write it, we say it, Satan. And the thing that always piques my interest is that the word for Satan in Hebrew is also Satan. And I always looked at that and wondered, why is that? That's really funny. The word in the Greek, which a lot of the New Testament is written in Greek for Satan, is also really similar, Satanus. And so this is kind of the reason that I'm doing this lesson, is because I've looked at that in the past and really wondered, why is that? You know, why does Satan just mean Satan? Is there something to be gained from understanding it better by looking into why is that? So, hence the lesson. Translation always seems like kind of the best option, I guess, because it just gives you a full context of the meaning if you just write the word cat in English. We all know what that is. But translation isn't always the best option because, well, it's not always a workable option, I should say, as far as not always best, because, you know, words have different meanings, there are characters that are different, there's sayings that are different. The way that words are structured within a sentence in other language doesn't always translate directly to the way that words are structured in English. So that is why transliteration in general happens, but it doesn't always happen, and it's just kind of interesting. It's interesting how and where these things occur in the Bible specifically. These languages are pretty different, which is another thing that piques my interest, because a lot of the words are not at all similar looking or sounding. You know, the word for love, Hebrew, ahava, Greek, agape. You know, these words don't sound alike and they don't look alike. Other words that are vastly different, like the word prayer. I am not going to try to pronounce the Hebrew and the Latin words for the word pray. But you can see that there's a vast difference between these languages with certain words, and it makes it kind of interesting how similar the word Satan is when you go across these languages. There's another fun one, amen. That one's the same across the board. It's translated in all languages, Hebrew, Greek, and English. Another interesting one is the word angel, because it's very different from the Hebrew word for angel, malaka, or malak, I think. But it's very similar to the Greek one, agelos. So it's a little bit of transliteration happening with the Greek word, or at least it stems from the Greek word for angel, very different from the Hebrew word. So this kind of gives you an idea of how some words get translated or transliterated from the ancient text to the English language that we have. And the thing that kind of piqued my interest is the word Satan. It's an important thing for us to understand, and there's a lot of differences between the way that it gets moved from an ancient Hebrew text to the way it gets moved to an English text. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit. The first question that you might have, and the first question I had, is why is Satan a transliterated word? Why wasn't it just translated? And so I started looking into things like the King James Version, the King James translation of the Bible, which occurred in 1611. Not recently, but at one point I had studied baptism with someone, because I was originally baptized Lutheran, the sprinkling of water, and I was later baptized by immersion. And so another Christian and I looked into the word baptism, where it came from, the fact that it comes from the word immersion, the fact that people were baptized by immersion, and that immersion appears to be the correct way to be baptized. And I had heard that perhaps King James wanted the transliteration to occur for the word baptized because he was sprinkling water, and he didn't want to confuse people by just translating it from immerse. And so he wanted to transliterate the word baptism to not confuse what he was doing. I found conflicting information as to whether or not that's true. I'm not entirely sure that's true. Maybe there's some truth to it, but I find some historians say no, they transliterated it for other reasons. But either way, when I did the research on the word Satan, the King James translators were not the first to transliterate the word Satan. If you go back further, the first English Bible to be translated somewhere between 1526 and 1534, I don't think every last book was translated, but a lot of them were, by William Tyndale, and he certainly did transliterate the word Satan, so predates the King James Version. He wasn't the first either. He did popularize the transliteration of the word Satan. There were other words for Satan that were popular back then, like Beelzebub, and I don't recall the others, but he wasn't credited with being the first to do it, but he did transliterate the word in the first English Bible printed. So then you can go back even further. Old English writings, not biblical translations, but just, writings, texts. Old English words that show up from things we've recovered dating as far back as 900 AD have transliterated the word Satan. So the word Satan does show up in these ancient texts. Again, not biblical translations, but just texts where they're talking about God, Satan, and other things. And so as far as why is Satan a transliterated word, I didn't really come up with an answer, because it's over 1,000 years old at least. I don't know why it was transliterated. It's just too much time has passed, and it's just been one of those things that's been handed down year after year. It's sort of like that old song, Frere Jacques, what does the song mean? What's it about? We don't know. But everybody knows the song. It's just one of those things that if it's been passed down year over year, the meaning becomes lost, the reason for it becomes lost, but the song survives. So, interesting as it is as to why, we can only really guess, but we know that it has been transliterated for a very long time. So that leads me to my next question when doing this research. Well, can Satan be translated to English? And sure, it can. There's a number of words that one could use to translate the word Satan. Some of the most common ones would be adversary, opponent, or accuser. And this all kind of makes sense in terms of how we understand Satan. I think it does, because God has an adversary in Satan. There is light, there is dark. So these things seem to work out fairly easily in my head as far as my understanding of Satan goes. The word in the Old Testament, and I will talk about the use in the New Testament, but I'll start in the Old Testament. Satan occurs 21 times in the Old Testament when addressing what we know of as Satan. It's addressed as Ha-Satan, which just translates to the Satan. So in our Bibles, it's just Satan rather than the Satan. Interestingly, the word Satan by itself, without the word the, does appear in the Hebrew Bible 6 times, and it is actually translated in those cases to accuse or oppose. It's used as a verb. A good example would be Psalm 38:20. And those who repay evil for good, they oppose me because I follow what is good. David in this case is likely talking about other human beings who are opposing him, not, Satan or the devil. But the word oppose there comes from the Hebrew word Satan. And it is, and certainly not lost on me, shouldn't be lost on anyone else, that the word Satan is showing up in a verse about good and evil. So this very powerful idea of God and Satan and good and evil, and the word Satan shows up in a very powerful way in this psalm that, we shouldn't leave this verse without thinking about that. That, this word that we've come to know as God's opposition and adversary can be used to describe, like a human action, but it is in the most severe way. Someone who's repaying evil for good and is completely opposing the good in humanity. Another very interesting verse in the Old Testament is Zechariah 3:1, because Satan's used as a verb only 6 times in the Old Testament, and it shows up in the same sentence with the use of Ha-Satan in the Old Testament, and that's in Zechariah 3 verse 1. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. New King James Version has oppose. And so that accuse translates from the word Satan, and that the word Satan translates from the word the Satan, Ha-Satan. And so that's really interesting. It's like saying the Satan was standing at his right hand to Satan him. But it's interesting to see that those two words, they occur so closely related in the Hebrew language, and they get a little bit separated when we translate the word accuse, but again, this word accuse is in the same sentence as some very powerful good versus evil things happening. Here it is Satan accusing, in this case, Joshua. This is like the most common place for Satan to show up, especially in the Old Testament, to accuse or oppose or be against, you could say, the faith of humanity in God or against God himself. So I find it, it helps me understand at least the verse a little bit to know that this word accuse is so closely related to what we know as the word Satan, or in this case, the Satan. Let's see, there are other cases, but I'm going to move on here to the next slide, because I was going to talk a little bit about Ha-Satan and the fact that it's the Satan, and that when we read it in our Bibles, it's just Satan. Does the matter? And that's a whole other very interesting topic worth diving into. But before I dive into that topic, I decided to take a minute and step back and talk about why I would dive into that topic. The why is certainly interesting. The why really stems from this reading in John chapter 1. We've been reading John, and this portrays what the why is better than I can with my words, that's for sure. So John chapter 1, verse 1. I'll start reading. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There came a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. So this is important to take a minute to step back and read this, because our understanding of Satan and our understanding of the word and how it's moved from Hebrew to English isn't going to be changed by, or isn't going to change any of this. This important idea that we should not lose sight of when we step back, that there is the light and there is the dark. The light certainly comes from God, and we know this to be true. The light was manifest through Christ, and understanding these things can help us live by the light and avoid the dark. Understanding the words should help us do that as well. With that in mind, I wanted to look at a few other ideas of how to help understand the word and why it's important. So, continuing my step back from the translation or transliteration from Satan, let's look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14. Remind them of these things and solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to ruin of the hearers. Be diligent to present yourselves approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. My goal here is to not wrangle about words, but to accurately handle the word of truth. That is what I hope to do. Accuracy can always be improved. That is what we are here to do every day when we study the Bible, when we try to understand the words and apply them into our lives. To further this idea, 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10 and 11. But one whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For indeed what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ, so that no advantage would be taken of us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. Forgiveness is important, as Paul points out. It helps you avoid being overtaken by Satan and his schemes. So this is another thing to be wary of, is that it is possible to be overtaken by Satan and his schemes. To know Satan and to know his schemes is to help us overcome them. And again, this is my goal for diving into the word Satan and the translation of it, and what is it? So with that, I'll begin to go back into this idea of what is this Satan, what is with the word the, and why is it there? The Satan, and is it any different than Satan? To be clear, the Bible doesn't exactly specifically tell us why the is there, but we can have some idea of why maybe once we look at how it's been used in the ancient Hebrew text. The is usually not used when addressing a person's name. I'm not the Nate, and it's not the David. The is usually used when addressing someone who holds a certain title or office. So the adversary, the accuser, the prosecutor is a little bit closer to translating the, like Satan. So in this case, it's a little more formal perhaps, but it's addressing the title of Satan, which is the accuser, rather than the actual name of the entity itself. It's certainly a singular entity. It's an entity that God can have a conversation with in Job and can address as one being. And again, we don't know specifically why it's addressed as the Satan in the Old Testament, which leads to many people to come up with ideas and thoughts about it. In looking into those ideas and thoughts, I don't know if I have my own conclusion as to what the formality is in the Old Testament and why it's just Satan in the New Testament, other than to say in general, well, The nature of Satan is made more clear to us in the New Testament. And beyond that, I'm not sure how to address it. Many people have tried. In my research into why the word "the" is there, there's a certain person who wrote an entire book on this that kept coming up, and I've lost his name. Where is his name? Well, you can come find me if you want to know. But his idea is that this office held by the adversary, an office like the secretary or the president, was actually appointed by God. I don't know if that's true, and it's not biblical to say it was, but it's a possibility. We don't know. And it seems that there is some relation there, at least, based on, mostly from Job is where that comes from. But in Job chapter 1, verse 12, we can read, "Then the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has in your power is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. So there is this conversational nature that occurs between the Lord and Satan at the time. And also we see that this office of Satan, the title, the Satan, is beholden to the command of the Lord. It is certainly not more powerful than the Lord, and it is subject to what the Lord commands. If the Lord commands Satan to not touch Job himself, then Satan must abide and must agree. And I think that's what leads some people to believe, well, maybe it's some sort of appointed case. But again, I'm not sure why that is. But we know that the fact that it is the adversary and the opposition gives us an idea that it is continuing to be the opposite, whether it is an office held by Satan or a title by Satan or just Satan. The functionality of what Satan is appears to be the same across the whole Bible. It is in opposition to God. It is in opposition to God's people on earth. It is there to tempt the faith of people and try to pull them away from God. So moving on to the New Testament. There are more references to Satan in the New Testament. It appears somewhere between 34 to 38 times. I didn't really have time into why people debate as to exactly how many, but that's more than the Old Testament. The devil is something that also appears in the New Testament. It comes from the Greek word diablos. That appears 37 times. That's in addition to the word Satan in the New Testament. There's also significant mentions to demons in the New Testament, about 60 times. Why more, you might ask? I certainly did. The idea as to why more is, well, again, the Bible doesn't tell us why more, but Christ comes to earth to address Satan, address the devil, and address what demons' functionality are. He also casts out demons to perform miracles. So, in short, that's likely why there are more mentions of Satan and the devil in the New Testament. So, here's a really interesting thing that I found. Well, I found it by finding someone else who found it online, but I added it to my presentation, and it comes from the parable of the sower. So the parable of the sower describes the seeds that were cast aside on the road. Those seeds are eaten up by the birds. And when Christ explains this parable to the people, he explains that the people on the side in Mark he says, the sower sows the word. These are the ones who are beside the road where the word is sown. And when they hear, immediately Satan comes and takes away the word which has been sown to them. So they didn't have time to hear it. They didn't have time to understand it. They cast the word aside right away, and they were snatched up by Satan. At least it's Satan in Mark. In Matthew 13, he says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. And in Luke, the same parable, those beside the road are those who have heard. Then the devil comes and takes away the word from their heart. And at this point, I started laughing at my computer screen because I think, well, Jesus must know I'm doing this study, and that's why he put it there. Because here I have undeniable proof that Christ told me that Satan, the evil one, and the devil are all the same being. Christ said so, so it is. So I have to look at my Bible and say, thank you for that. This makes it so much easier for me. So the devil and diablos, and here Satan, these are specific names for a specific being, and our nature of coming to understand the way that the devil works comes hand in hand with our nature of understanding the way that God works, and it comes from Christ. And it occurs in the New Testament. And this nature of understanding continues into 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. So here Peter describes the devil in great detail as far as how he acts. He's like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So the nature of the devil is certainly an unfriendly one, certainly unfriendly to us. It is like a predatory animal, and it looks for us. And this certainly reminds me of a case in the Old Testament where the word Satan doesn't show up, but the devouring animal certainly does. In Genesis Genesis chapter 4, verse 5, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. God says something very interesting to Cain about this. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Sin is crouching at the door. Definitely not the word for Satan, but sin is crouching like a predatory lion, like the same lion described in 1 Peter. And it's interesting that the word sin is there, and it's so closely related to the crouching lion wishing to devour, and it's very much the same idea as the word devil in the New Testament. And it really gives me the idea, and I'm right at 9:45, but the idea that this battle between what we were talking about with the light and the dark has been going on since the creation of the world, and it's been occurring in Cain and Abel, and it's occurring within us as well. And the idea that the dark is like a predatory animal seeking us goes right back to Cain, that the predatory animal is at the door. How to resist this predatory animal and this temptation, this sin, the devil, or you could just say the dark, to master it.